In this video, we are going to work with our swap method, which will allow us to swap items of our feed. So the first thing I'm going to do is to add 3 new properties. If we scroll up to our data, we are going to add 3 new items. First one will be called interval, which will be set to null by default. Then we are going to have paused, set to false, indicating whether the feed has been paused by clicking either previous or next button. Then we are going to have swapping property, which will also be set to false by default. Now, if we scroll down back to our swap method, and let's actually move this active class before this swap method, because all the other methods will follow after this one. Okay, and I'm going to close the file browser on the left-hand side. And from within this swap method, I'm going to start with this interval equals window set interval. And it takes the callback as the first argument. And the second argument will represent the duration which has been injected to this component using the properties. So this duration, as you may remember, if we open the file browser, if I just open index.html, the duration we've set to 5 seconds, so 5,000 milliseconds. You can obviously change it whenever you want, but by default, if we scroll up, if we look at the props, duration by default is 7 seconds. Okay, and I'm going to close the file browser on the left again. The setInterval function creates an indefinite loop, meaning that it will loop all the time until you call clearInterval function on it, on its instance. So obviously that's why we're associating it with this interval. So later on, we can just clear it and stop these iterations. Okay, now it takes first argument, which is what we want to happen with each iteration, and then how long should it take before the next iteration should take place. In other words, the delay between the iterations. So what I want to happen with each iteration. First of all, I'm going to check if our component hasn't been paused. So I'm going to check if, and I'm going to use the opposite. So I'm going to check if it's not paused, so this paused. Then I'm going to call this next slide method, and let's quickly add this method stop after the swap. So next slide, and let's just leave it like this for now. Now, one problem that we're going to be facing here is that we are referring to these methods using this keyword, and because we are calling it from within this closure, this anonymous function, which is wrapped with a set interval, it does not refer to the same scope. Which means in order for us to be able to use this keyword and refer to the items of our component, we need to bind this instance to this closure. So what we're going to do after the closing curly bracket for this anonymous function, we are going to use full stop, bind, and then we pass this to it. So it passes instance of itself, so we can refer to all these methods using this keyword within this closure. So that's our swap method completed. So once again, what it will do with each iteration, it will check if our component hasn't been paused, and if it hasn't, then it will go to the next slide. And now from within the next slide, we are going to start with setting this swapping to true, indicating that we want to swap item for the new one. And then we are going to use window set timeout. Set timeout works in a similar way that set interval does. The only difference is that it only runs once. Set interval creates an indefinite loop, whereas set timeout will execute the function disclosure after specified number of seconds. So we are going to start with the function again, this closure, and we want it to be executed after 1 second. So when this next slide method is called, we're going to change the swapping to true, wait 1 second, and then execute what inside of this closure. And inside of this closure, what I'm going to do is do this current, and I'm going to associate it with a new method called next. So this next. And let's quickly add the method stop. So next. And we'll deal with this method in just a moment. Again, we are using this keyword here, referring to the internal properties and methods of our component, but we are within the closure, which is inside of this set timeout. So obviously we don't have access to this scope. Again, we need to use bind and pass instance of this component to this bind method, so we can actually refer to these properties and methods on our component instance. Okay, so we've got current set to the next item, then this swapping will set to false. So we can move this cover back to the right. When we set swapping to true, cover will cover the current item. When we change it to false, it will go back to the right, revealing the new item. So from within the next method, we need to return the index of the item that we want to show next, because we are associating it with this current property. So the first thing I'm going to do is check if this current triple equal symbol this max. Then we are going to return 0. And what this does, it checks if current index equals the maximum index, because max will represent the length of our items array, meaning how many items there are, minus 1, because we're obviously using array starting from 0. So if we have 10 items, it needs to start from 0. It will indicate that the last item is 9th item. So if the current item is this 9th item, for instance, if we're talking about 10 items in a collection, then we want to display the first item after this last one. That's why we're returning index 0, starting from the beginning. Otherwise, what we're going to return is going to be this current plus 1. So if we are on item 3, we want to go to item 4. So we just add 1 to the current index. So that will associate this value returned from this next method with the current property, changing the item behind the scenes. Okay, so if we now run our npm run dev to compile all the files, and once everything's been done, if we go back to the browser, refresh the page, and if we go to the view console, click on a horizontal fit, you'll see we have current set to 0, but have a look at the fit. There we go, it's changed, the current set to 1. And again, we're waiting 5 seconds, that will change to 2, and so on. After 2, because we only have 3 items, that should go back to 0. And it does. As you can see, these items are changing, but our cover doesn't cover them to swap the items behind the cover and then reveal them. So if we go back to our editor, what I'm going to do is to go up to our data, and after the data, I'm going to add another method called computed. It's actually a property which will contain computed properties for our component. What computed properties are? They are like standard properties like this ones here within the data object, which is being returned from this data method. The only difference is computed properties allow you to do some thinking before the value is being returned. So as here, for instance, we have static values associated with them. From within the computed properties, we can actually do some expressions, check for things before we actually return the value. So computed, and we're going to start with a swapping class. And from within the swapping class, and even though it's called property, they are actually methods of this computed object. So swapping, we're going to return again object with the class swapping, and we want to return this class only when this swapping is set to true. And swapping property obviously represents the boolean false or true. Okay, so now we need to use this swapping class on our body, on the body of our component. So on the body tag, we are going to bind class to it again, and this time we are going to use this swapping class property. And because it's a property, although technically it's a method of a computed object, we are going to call it without the brackets. Okay, so now what's going to happen, if I go back to the terminal and make sure that we have everything compiled. Now this swapping class has, if we just go back to our editor and open our source SCSS components, and if we open horizontal fit, and if we scroll up to the section where we have this swapping class applied. So swapping class, if I just collapse all this just to show you, obviously we have cover here, and then swapping class is being applied to the body tag. Sorry, not the body tag, the div with the class body. So once it's applied, the cover will change its width to 100%, and the padding on the left is going to change to 0.8 rem. And it will change animating because we have this CSS3 transition applied to the cover, as you can see, to all its attributes, and we want this to happen at the speed of 0.3 milliseconds. So that's why it's going to be nicely animated. But I've just noticed there is one problem with this cover. This cover will work, and if we just save it all, go to our terminal, compile everything and refresh the page, you'll see that it will move to the left, but it won't cover the item. And why won't it cover the item? Because we didn't apply any background color to this cover. That's why it goes there, the item swaps, but you can still see that the item swaps and nothing covers anything. Okay, so let's go back to the editor. For the cover, I'm going to apply background color, same as background of the feed, so it's going to be feed BG. Okay, if we now save it and compile everything again, and if we preview everything in browser, refresh the page, you can see now our cover covers the item, swaps it behind the scenes, and reveals the new one. Okay, so that's it in this video. Let's move to the next one.